The sky over Germany was a cauldron of steel and fire. The sun, dimmed by a haze of smoke, glared down on thousands of contrails. White scars scratched across a pale winter sky. Below them, engines roared and machine guns rattled like metallic thunder. Amid this chaos, one man flew alone, his heart pounding inside the thin aluminum shell of a P-51 Mustang. His name was James, an American fighter pilot about to make history. It was January 11, 1944, and the air war over Germany had reached its boiling point. The 8th Air Force had launched another daylight bombing mission deep into the heart of the Reich, targeting critical aircraft production centers. For months, Allied bombers had taken to the skies in unrelenting waves, massive armadas of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators streaking toward the industrial core of Nazi Germany. But these missions came with a deadly cost. Without long-range fighter protection, bomber crews were left at the mercy of the Luftwaffe. Every raid felt like rolling dice with death. Bomber crews knew the odds: flak, enemy fighters, freezing altitudes. For the men inside those tin beasts, survival depended on precision, teamwork, and sheer luck. The Luftwaffe, though stretched thin and bloodied, still commanded the skies over Europe with a lethal mix of discipline and desperation. The 109s and 190s, piloted by battle-hardened aces, tore through bomber formations with surgical precision. But January 11 wasn't supposed to be just another bombing run. It would become a turning point, a day when one man's courage symbolized the Allies shifting control of the air war. James was no ordinary pilot. Before joining the U.S. Army Air Forces, he'd flown with the legendary Flying Tigers in China, battling Japanese Zeros over Burma. He tasted the loneliness of single combat and learned how to fight outnumbered and survive. Now, assigned to the 356th Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group, was flying one of the most advanced fighters ever built, the North American P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and deadly, the Mustang was the Allies' answer to the Luftwaffe's domination, a plane that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. On that frigid January morning, more than 600 B-17s lifted off from England, their engines echoing like a rising tide of vengeance. Their target, and two vital aircraft assembly plants feeding the German war machine. As the bombers crossed the coast, they climbed to 25,000 feet, condensation streaming off their wings like ghosts in the cold. Below them, the shadow of war stretched across occupied Europe. Led his small flight of P-51s as part of the escort. His orders were simple: protect the bombers. But war never follows orders cleanly. As they approached the target area, the radio crackled, fragments of panic and warning. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high, many bandits." The Luftwaffe had come. Like hawks swooping on wounded prey, over 30 German fighters broke through the clouds, diving on the bomber stream. They came fast and furious, their guns flashing, their engines howling. Within seconds, the sky was a battlefield, a swirling ballet of smoke, tracers, and vapor trails. Looked around, his flight was scattered. Somewhere in the chaos, his wingmen had become separated. For a moment, he was utterly alone, one Mustang against an entire squadron of German fighters. Most pilots would have turned back or climbed away to safety, but not James. What happened next would echo through the halls of Air Force legend. Rolled his Mustang into a climb, tracing the contrails of the enemy, closing distance with impossible courage. His guns chattered, and a 109 exploded in a flash of flame. Then another. The Germans, thinking he had backup, broke formation to engage. Twisted, turned, dove, and climbed, an aerial phantom moving through impossible odds. For more than half an hour, he fought alone against wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters. Each burst of gunfire was a gamble. Each maneuver a heartbeat between life and death. His ammunition ran low, his fuel gauge dipped perilously, but he stayed in the fight, darting between bombers, covering their blind spots, driving off attackers. Bomber crews watched in disbelief. Inside one B-17, a gunner shouted over the intercom, "There's one Mustang out there, just one. And he's taking on the whole damn Luftwaffe." The voice carried both awe and hope. For those men trapped inside their trembling, flak-pocked bombers, Sloan's figure became a symbol of defiance, a guardian angel streaking through the clouds. When the fight finally ended, the sky fell eerily quiet. The Luftwaffe had retreated, leaving behind smoking trails and falling wrecks. His Mustang limped home, riddled with bullet holes, fuel almost gone but still flying. Back at airfield in England, when landed, the ground crew stared in stunned silence. His aircraft bore the scars of battle, holes through the wings, scorch marks along the fuselage, But the man who stepped out was calm, almost modest. When asked how many enemy planes he'd shot down, he simply said, "I don't know. It was just me out there." In truth, witnesses confirmed he'd taken on as many as 30 German fighters, alone, and lived to tell about it. Word spread fast. By the next morning's name was on every officer's lips. The bomber crews who'd watched him fight swore they'd seen a miracle. One crewman said, "If I could, I'd fly with that guy any day. He's the kind of man who'd fight the devil himself if you told him to." His act of valor had become something more, a signal that the tide of air power was shifting. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, was beginning to lose its grip on the skies over Europe. As winter deepened and the bombing campaign intensified, the Allies were no longer flying blind into the jaws of death. They had the Mustang, and they had men like James. But behind every act of heroism lies a deeper story. What drove to fight alone that day? What did he see, feel, or remember as he stared into the chaos of aerial combat? That answer lies beyond the smoke and fire of January 11. It begins long before, the story of a young man who chose to fight, not for glory, but for duty, and whose courage in a cold sky would forever change the fate of a war. Before the smoke-filled skis over, before the metallic scream of bullets ripping past his canopy, James was simply a boy fascinated by flight. Born on April 8, 1913 in Canton, China, to an American doctor and missionary, childhood was steeped in a world of contrasts, the serenity of the East and the restless spirit of the West. From a young age, he'd watched biplanes trace slow arcs across the sky above the Yangtze River. Those machines seemed to him both mysterious and godlike, vessels that could break the chains of the earth and reach the quiet heavens. When his family returned to the United States in the 1920s, carried that fascination with him. The sky to him was freedom, a place untouched by the noise of the world below. He studied hard, earned a degree in architecture from Pomona College, and even considered a conventional life. But the pull of flight was too strong. The world was changing and could feel the storm brewing across oceans. By the mid-1930s, dark clouds were forming over Europe and Asia. Nations arming, ideologies clashing, and empires stirring from their long slumber. Joined the U.S. Navy in 1938, drawn not by a thirst for glory, but by the chance to fly. He earned his wings and served aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, mastering the art of naval aviation, launching from a pitching deck, landing on a moving target, learning to read the sky like a second language. But even as he served, the world tilted closer to chaos. In the Pacific, Japan's ambitions grew more aggressive, and the whispers of war became thunder. By 1941, made a fateful choice. He resigned his Navy commission to join the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers. Led by the legendary Lee, the AVG was a ragtag band of American pilots hired by China to defend its skies from Japanese invasion. For it was a calling. He'd been born in China, now he would return to defend it. The Flying Tigers were unlike any official military unit. They were mercenaries in spirit, heroes in function. Paid by the kill, they flew old P-40 painted with fearsome shark mouths, facing waves of Japanese Zero fighters that outnumbered and outperformed them. But what the Tigers lacked in technology, they made up for in grit and cunning. His time in China forged him. The air battles over the jungles of Burma and the dusty runways of Kunming taught him lessons no classroom could. He learned how to survive when outnumbered, how to read the enemy's rhythm, and above all, how to stay calm when death flew beside him. The P-40 was a beast, heavy, temperamental, and sluggish at altitude, but made it sing. His cool precision and analytical mind earned him quiet respect among his peers. He wasn't the loudest pilot, nor the most boastful. But when the engines roared and bullets filled the air, James became something else entirely, methodical, unbreakable, relentless. In the skis over Asia, he discovered the kind of courage that comes not from bravado, but from clarity. There's a story often told among surviving Flying Tigers. One day, while escorting bombers near Rangoon, his formation was ambushed by a superior force of Japanese fighters. As his comrades broke away, stayed behind, covering their retreat. Alone, he wove through tracer fire, diving and climbing until his guns went silent. But instead of fleeing, he maneuvered into a waited and re-emerged to strike again. The Japanese pilots, convinced they were facing multiple attackers, broke off. When landed, his aircraft was riddled with bullet holes, but his expression was calm. When someone asked him what had happened up there, he simply said, "Just doing the job." That quiet professionalism would become his hallmark. When the AVG disbanded in 1942, returned to the U.S. and joined the Army Air Forces. The world had changed. America was now at war. The skis of Europe called next. By late 1943, he was flying a new machine, the P-51 Mustang, and leading men half his age into battle. The Mustang was everything the old wasn't: sleek, fast, capable of climbing higher and flying farther than any Allied fighter before it. Its design was revolutionary: laminar flow wings, a powerful built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and a long, elegant frame that made it the envy of every pilot. The Mustang was more than a plane, it was an extension of his will. He trusted it the way a swordsman trusts his blade. Under his command, the 356th Fighter Squadron began to carve a reputation for precision and fearlessness. His leadership style was steady, never theatrical. He didn't yell. He didn't boast. He led from the front, literally. When missions grew dangerous, he was always the first off the runway and the last to return. Still, those early days in England were uncertain. The Luftwaffe dominated the continent's skies. Allied bombers were being shredded by interceptors before they could reach their targets. The bomber crews, young men in their early 20s, had begun to lose faith. Some whispered that the daylight bombing campaign was suicide. Others prayed for miracle escorts that could keep the Germans at bay. That miracle arrived in the form of the P-51, and in the hands of men like it became an omen for the enemy. But courage knew wasn't about defiance alone. It was about duty and the quiet acceptance of fear. In letters to his family, he never romanticized combat. "Every mission," he once wrote, "you wonder if you'll see another sunrise, but you go anyway because someone has to." As the winter of 1943 turned to 1944, and his men faced their hardest test, the 8th Air Force had begun striking deeper into Germany than ever before. The raids on and weren't just strategic, they were symbolic. If the Allies could cripple the Luftwaffe's aircraft production, they could finally seize the air. On the morning of January 11, as prepared for takeoff, the ground crews moved with quiet urgency. Frost clung to the edges of the airfield at. The Mustangs, lined up in silver formation, looked like predators waiting for the hunt. Climbed into his cockpit, checked his instruments, and adjusted his oxygen mask. Around him, the steady rhythm of engines grew into a roar. Before throttling forward, he took a deep breath. The mission ahead was dangerous, the weather uncertain, and the Luftwaffe would surely be waiting. But none of that mattered now. The men in those bombers depended on him, and that was enough. As he taxied toward the runway, looked up at the faint dawn light breaking through the clouds. For a brief moment, he thought of China, the jungles, the smoke, the sound of gunfire, and how far he'd come. Then the signal came. He pushed the throttle. The Mustang surged forward, wheels leaving the ground as England dropped away beneath him. Ahead lay Germany, and the day when the Luftwaffe would learn that the sky no longer belonged to them. The morning of January 11, 1944, dawned cold and gray, the kind of bitter European winter that turned breath to frost and oil to sludge. Across the English countryside, engines coughed to life in the half-light, their deep rumble echoing across the frozen airfields. In the distance, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s were lining up for takeoff, their wings glistening faintly with ice. For James, the day began like countless others: briefing room, map tables, and the smell of coffee gone cold. The mission plan was pinned to a board, bold red lines slicing across the map of Europe. The targets were, and both critical to the German aircraft industry. These were the beating hearts of the Reich's fighter production, and if they could be destroyed, the Luftwaffe would bleed. The room buzzed with quiet tension. Officers spoke in clipped tones, their breath visible in the chilly air. The words "heavy resistance expected" echoed through the briefing like a bad omen. The weather over the channel was poor, the clouds thick and low, perfect conditions for an ambush. Still, the orders were clear. The 8th Air Force would go, whether or not. Sat at the edge of the room, studying the map in silence. Around him, younger pilots cracked nervous jokes, some lighting cigarettes they didn't finish. A few wrote quick notes, words for wives, mothers, or sweethearts they might never see again. The unspoken truth of every mission hung heavy in the air. Someone wouldn't come back. When the briefing ended, the pilots filed out, their boots crunching over frost. Mechanics swarmed over the planes, checking fuel, loading ammunition, and tightening panels. The P-51 Mustangs, polished silver with shark-like noses, gleamed beneath the dim sun. They were the weapons in the Allied arsenal, and the men who flew them were proud if wary of what they could do. Approached his aircraft, ding. the words meaning very good in Chinese, a small nod to his days with the flying tigers. Painted beneath the canopy was a tiger's head, teeth bared, eyes fierce. He ran a gloved hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal vibrate faintly as the engine warmed. His crew chief, a young man named Sergeant Bill King, approached with a clipboard. "Fuel topped off, sir. Guns are loaded, 1,260 rounds, as always." Nodded. "Good work, Bill." King hesitated, then added quietly, "You be careful up there, Major. They say waiting in force today." Gave a small smile. "They usually are." The engines began to roar one by one, a chorus of mechanical thunder rising over the airfield. Taxied his Mustang to the runway, eyes scanning the sky already thick with vapor from the departing bombers. The B-17s, flying in tight box formations, looked like a fleet of silver whales lumbering toward war. Each carried 10 men, 10 stories, gunners, bombardiers, pilots, all counting on the small escort of fighters to keep death at bay. As squadron climbed, the English countryside vanished beneath a blanket of mist. Above them, the sky opened, cold, blue, and endless. The P-51s leveled out at 25,000 feet, forming a loose screen around the bombers. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, from the coast of France to the industrial plains of central Germany. Radio chatter filled the cockpit, static call signs, coded phrases. "Red leader to blue flight, form up." "Bandits reported over Bremen." "Maintain altitude, stay with the heavies." The calm efficiency of voices masking the pounding hearts behind them. As they crossed into occupied territory, flak began to bloom below, black puffs bursting like malignant flowers against the pale sky. Watched the shells explode in rhythmic bursts, some close enough to rock the bombers. The sky filled with shrapnel and smoke, the smell of cordite even reaching his oxygen mask. Then, faint at first, came the call that would define the day. "Bogies 11 o'clock high, multiple contacts." Craned his neck and saw them, distant glints in the sun, growing fast. The Luftwaffe. They came in disciplined waves, 109s and 190s, climbing from the east like a swarm of hornets. The Germans had learned the bombers' patterns. They knew where to strike, straight at the formation's heart, tearing through the vulnerable middle. His mind snapped into focus. Training, instinct, and experience took over. "Break, break, blue flight, cover high." His voice was steady, almost calm. Beneath him, bombers shifted formation, turrets swiveling toward the threat. The Luftwaffe dove in, guns flashing. The first pass was brutal. 2 B-17s went down in flames, their wings shearing off as they tumbled through the clouds. Parachutes blossomed below, tiny white dots drifting through smoke. The air filled with tracers, streaks of red and green like fireflies in a storm. Spotted a cluster of enemy fighters breaking through the formation and rolled his Mustang toward them. His wingmen followed for a moment. Then chaos swallowed them. Radio calls overlapped, engines screamed, and visibility vanished in the smoke and vapor. In seconds, realized he was alone. It was a moment every pilot dreaded. 1 second, you're part of a squadron, disciplined, coordinated, confident. The next, you're a solitary speck in an ocean of enemies. His jaw tightened. He could see the German fighters ripping into the bombers, dozens of them, swooping in pairs, firing and diving away. The bombers were sitting ducks, their defensive fire too scattered to repel the assault. Could turn back, regroup, and wait for his flight to rejoin. But he didn't. Something inside him, perhaps that same unyielding spirit that had carried him through the jungles of Burma, refused to yield. He throttled forward, his Mustang leaping ahead. The Merlin engine roared, its note rising like an animal's growl, dove into the melee. He lined up behind a 109, squeezed the trigger. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber Browning spat fire. The German fighter exploded in a flash, debris spiraling through the formation. Without breaking stride, climbed, rolled, and came down on another. His rounds tore through its fuselage, sending it spinning earthward. But for everyone he struck, 3 more appeared. They swarmed like hornets, their tracers slicing past his canopy. Jinked, rolled, inverted, and dove, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. His breath came in sharp bursts through the mask. His mind went silent, pure focus. He had entered that rare state every veteran pilot spoke of but few ever reached, where thought vanished and instinct ruled. Every movement, every shot, every roll flowed seamlessly into the next. Somewhere in the chaos, a bomber gunner saw him pass. "There's one Mustang out there," he yelled through the intercom. "He's taking them all on by himself." and indeed was alone, one man, one plane, against the entire Luftwaffe attack group. He darted through bomber formations, cutting off attackers, drawing their fire, and striking when they least expected. His Mustang became a phantom, here 1 second, gone the next. He chased down a that was bearing on a crippled B-17, riddled it with bullets, and pulled up just in time to avoid the explosion. The sky was chaos, smoke trails, burning wrecks, falling parachutes. But amid it all, one figure stood between the bombers and annihilation. For 30 long minutes, James fought alone. His ammunition ran low, his fuel was bleeding away, his canopy was pocked with holes, yet he refused to break off. The Germans, confused and shaken by his aggression, began to retreat. One after another, they peeled away, disappearing into cloud banks. When the last of them fled, took a long breath. The sky was eerily quiet now, the bombers still pressing on toward their targets, engines droning like an endless heartbeat. Looked around, the horizon was empty, his gauges were dropping, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he let his hand rest for a moment on the throttle. He'd done it. Against all logic, all odds, he'd protected them. When James finally eased back on his throttle, the sudden stillness was almost unreal. The sky, moments ago a violent tangle of flame and smoke, had gone eerily calm. His Mustang, Ding, shuddered as he leveled off, its engine coughing faintly under strain. The smell of cordite and burnt oil filled the cockpit. His oxygen mask was damp with sweat. The radio crackled faintly with static, broken now, and then by faint, distant voices. Bomber crews calling for status, confirming kills, mourning the lost. Looked around, the formation he had fought to protect was still flying. Dozens of bombers, leaking smoke but alive, lumbered eastward, sunlight glinting off their battered frames. He could see bullet holes stitched across their wings and fuselages. Some had engines out, one trailed a long ribbon of black smoke, but they were still moving. They would make it to the target. For a long moment, he simply watched them. The enormity of what had just happened was hard to process. He'd been in countless dogfights before with the Flying Tigers over Burma in the Pacific, but nothing like this. 30 minutes of pure combat. Alone. No backup, no wingman, no chance to retreat. He had faced nearly 30 enemy fighters and lived. His hands trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear, from the flood of adrenaline leaving his system. In those 30 minutes, he had operated beyond human limits. Now, as the Mustang's engine hummed its steady rhythm, reality began to return. He checked his gauges. Fuel was dangerously low. Ammunition nearly gone. One gun was jammed, the others nearly empty. The right wing bore a long line of holes, and the canopy glass was spiderwebbed from near misses. A lesser plane might have failed. But the P-51 was built for endurance, and steady hand brought it home. He turned the Mustang west, leaving the bombers to continue their run. Below, the landscape stretched out in patchwork, snow-dusted fields, dark forests, and small towns that, for now, still lay under German control. Somewhere below, smoke columns rose, evidence of the day's destruction. As crossed back over the channel hours later, the afternoon light had faded into the soft gray of winter dusk. England's coast appeared beneath him, calm and indifferent to the day's fury. His radio crackled with the voice of ground control. Tower to Blue Leader, identify. His reply came, calm and even. Blue Leader, single aircraft returning from mission. A pause, then. Roger, Blue Leader, you're the first back. What's your status? Exhaled, a faint smile forming under his mask. Operational, he said simply. The Mustang's wheels touched down on the frozen runway just after 4 p.m. Mechanics rushed toward it, waving and shouting. The aircraft rolled to a stop, its engine sputtering before cutting out. When opened the canopy, the cold air hit him like a wall. He sat for a moment, breathing before climbing out. The ground crew gathered around the Mustang in disbelief. Bullet holes peppered the wings and fuselage, more than 60 by one mechanic's count. One control surface was half-torn, the right wing fuel tank nearly empty. "Good God," muttered Sergeant Bill King. "What in hell happened up there, Major?" Just looked at him, quiet for a moment. "Just a bit of company," he said finally with a faint grin. Word began to spread even before he'd finished debriefing. Pilots returning later that afternoon had heard fragments of the story over radio chatter. Bomber crews had already landed at other bases, their gunners telling anyone who'd listen about the lone Mustang that had fought like 10 men. One B-17 crewman swore he'd seen shoot down 6 fighters on his own. Another said he'd counted at least 30 Luftwaffe aircraft in the engagement. When the official reports came in, it was chaos, exaggerated accounts, incomplete gun camera footage, missing flight data. The only certainty was that one pilot, Major James H., had single-handedly taken on an overwhelming enemy force to protect the bombers. The following morning, sat in the mess hall sipping coffee when the door swung open and Colonel, the group commander, walked in. He said, "You've started quite a storm." Looked up puzzled, "Sir, the bomber crews are calling you a one-man air force." Chuckled, "They're being generous," but didn't smile. "They're not exaggerating much, Major. Reports say you took on 30-plus Luftwaffe aircraft by yourself. You're going to have to make a statement." Sighed, he wasn't a man fond of attention. "I was just doing my job," he said. Still, the story spread like wildfire. Newspapers picked it up within days. Headlines read, "Lone Yank fighter defends bombers against 30 foes and one-man air force holds the line." Reporters flooded the base, desperate for quotes and photographs. Ever modest, gave them few. "It wasn't about glory," he said to one journalist. "It was about keeping those men alive." Behind the scenes, the U.S. Army Air Forces were reviewing his report for a potential Medal of Honor recommendation, the highest military decoration in the United States. Only one fighter pilot in the European theater had ever been considered before. But himself didn't dwell on it. In his mind, the mission had been just one day among many. There would be more to come. The war wasn't over. The Luftwaffe was wounded, not dead. Still, among the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, the story took on near-mythic proportions. One tail gunner wrote home, "We thought we were done for. Then this single Mustang showed up. He came out of nowhere like an angel. You could see him darting through the enemy fighters, covering us. It was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." Back in, the 354th Fighter Group celebrated quietly. To them, wasn't just a hero, he was proof that discipline and courage could still turn the tide. The younger pilots listened in awe as he described the fight in his usual understated tone. "You don't think," he told them. "You just do what has to be done. If you stop to think about the odds, you're already finished." That night, as the men drifted back to their bunks, lingered by his Mustang in the hangar. The plane looked battered but proud, its silver skin catching the dim light. He rested a hand on its nose. "Good work, girl," he whispered. "You did fine." Outside, the wind howled across the frozen airfield. Beyond the horizon, Germany still burned. The war raged on and knew that tomorrow would bring another mission, another battle, another test. But for now, for one quiet night, he allowed himself the smallest luxury, the belief that courage in the right moment could still change the course of a war. By the time the sun rose over the next morning, James' name had already traveled farther than any P-51 ever could. The radio operators were still decoding after-action reports, but across England, whispers were turning into legend. Bomber crews at airfields from two were repeating the same incredible story of a single Mustang that had fought off the Luftwaffe alone for half an hour. However, began the day as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He dressed quietly, buttoned his flight jacket, and walked to the mess hall for breakfast. The air smelled of eggs and burnt coffee, the usual comfort before chaos. Around him, men spoke in hushed tones, some stealing glances his way. The young pilots of the 354th Fighter Group now looked at him differently, as though the quiet, unassuming major who rarely raised his voice had become something larger than life overnight. Didn't like the attention. Fame, to him, was a distraction. He'd seen too many good men start believing their own press and end up buried for it. After breakfast, he met with his group commander, Colonel, for debriefing. Stacks of mission reports littered the desk, gun camera footage, bomber crew statements, intelligence logs. The colonel leaned back, rubbing his temples. "You realize, Major, we've got at least a dozen different accounts of what happened out there. Some say you shot down 6, others say 8. One guy swears he counted 12 enemy aircraft diving on you at once." Sat calmly, hands folded. "Doesn't matter how many," he said. "They didn't get the bombers." "That's not the point," replied. "The point is no one ever seen anything like it. You fought alone against half a Luftwaffe group. That's something command can't ignore." Shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, sir, I'd rather they did." Smiled faintly. "You don't get to decide that, Jim. The brass are already drafting the paperwork. You might want to start getting used to the idea that you're a hero." Didn't answer. The word hero had always made him uneasy. He'd seen real heroes, men who flew into hopeless odds and never came back. Men whose names no one would remember. He didn't want to wear their legacy like a medal. Outside, the airfield buzzed with new activity. Crews were repairing planes, refueling for the next sortie, and checking the radio frequencies. The war never stopped, not for headlines, not for heroes. But the story refused to fade. Within days, it reached London, then Washington. Newspaper correspondents began arriving eager for interviews. Stars and Stripes ran a feature calling him the Lone Wolf of the Skis. Another dubbed him the One-Man Air Force. When the Associated Press reporter finally cornered him, remained modest, almost terse. "Major, the crews say you took on 30 enemy planes by yourself. Is that true?" Shrugged, "I didn't count them." "But you fought alone for over half an hour." "That's about right." "What kept you in the fight, Major, when anyone else would have turned back?" Looked at the man for a long moment before answering quietly, "Those bombers didn't have anyone else." The quote spread like wildfire. It was printed in newspapers across the U.S., reprinted in pamphlets, even read over the radio by war correspondents. For families with sons flying over Europe, it became a symbol, proof that someone up there was watching over them. Back at return to business. There were still missions to fly, still green pilots to train, still a war to win. The Luftwaffe was far from finished. In fact, within weeks, they would strike back with desperate ferocity, fueled by the humiliation of. But leadership began to change the 354th. His calm under pressure became the squadron's heartbeat. Younger flyers who once fought recklessly now flew smarter, more disciplined. They studied his combat reports, memorized his maneuvers, learned his patience. One lieutenant, fresh from flight school, once told him, "Sir, when I'm up there and it gets bad, I just try to imagine what you'd do." Smiled faintly. Probably the same thing you're doing, trying not to get killed. Yet beneath his dry humor, he carried a heavy truth. The air war was evolving. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, but the cost for the Allies was steep. Every mission brought back fewer bombers. Every debriefing ended with empty chairs. In February, the group was ordered to support Big Week, Operation Argument, a massive Allied assault on the German aircraft industry. Hundreds of bombers and fighters would hit targets across the Reich in a coordinated offensive. It was the culmination of what mission had foreshadowed, a full-scale attempt to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to wage air war. The briefings were grim. Intelligence warned that the Germans were preparing a desperate defense. Some Luftwaffe pilots were barely trained, others were veterans running on fumes. The skis, they said, would be chaos. Studied the maps in silence. He knew what that meant. "They'll throw everything they have left at us," he said, "and we'll be outnumbered again." Nodded, "But this time we've got Mustangs, and we've got you." The operation began on February 20. For 6 days, Allied bombers pounded German cities, airfields, and factories. The P-51s roamed the skis freely, striking enemy fighters before they could even reach the bomber streams. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was being hunted, not the hunter. Squadron flew multiple sorties during those days. The sky was filled with wreckage, contrails, and fire. Even the veterans could feel it. The tide had turned. The Germans still fought fiercely, but the fear that had once haunted Allied was fading. The Mustang, sleek and unstoppable, now ruled the air. But victory had its price. Lost friends. Men he'd trained, laughed with, shared missions with. Their empty bunks were silent reminders that even heroes couldn't protect everyone. Late one evening, after another exhausting mission, sat alone in the briefing room. A single bulb cast long shadows across the maps and photos on the wall. He poured himself a cup of black coffee gone cold. The hum of generators filled the silence. He took a deep breath and looked at the mission board, so many names, so many crossed out. The room smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. On the desk beside him lay a letter from his father in Missouri. The old man had read about the one-man Air Force in the papers and wrote simply, "We're proud, son, but we'll be prouder still when you come home." Folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. He looked up at the wall, a map of Europe dotted with pins marking Allied advances. Slowly, methodically, the noose was tightening around Germany. But knew the worst was still to come. The war might be turning, but the cost of victory would be measured not in medals or headlines, but in lives. And as he turned out the light and stepped into the cold night, the sound of engines starting in the distance reminded him of the truth he could never escape. Heroes didn't rest. They just flew again the next day. Spring came slowly to England in 1944, thawing the frostbitten earth but not the tension that hung over every airfield. The days were longer now, the air still damp, the runways streaked with puddles from passing rain. In the mess halls, pilots talked quietly of rumors, an invasion, a new offensive, a decisive push that would finally bring Europe crashing down. But for James and the men of the 354th Fighter Group, the war remained what it had always been. Missions, briefings, losses, and the endless waiting between them. His legend had settled into something heavier than fame. It had become expectation. Whenever his Mustang ding roared to life on the tarmac, every mechanic, pilot, and gunner seemed to watch. He was their proof that courage still meant something in a war that often felt mechanical and senseless. The newspapers still called him the one-man Air Force, but carried the weight of that name like a stone in his chest. He didn't feel like a hero, he felt like a survivor. Each time he strapped into his Mustang, he was acutely aware that the odds could turn just as easily against him. The Luftwaffe might have been bleeding, but it was not broken. In desperation, the Germans were throwing everything they had into the skis: veteran pilots, green cadets, even experimental jet aircraft that whispered of a new and terrifying era of warfare. In April, Group was reassigned temporarily to deep escort duty over central Germany. The missions were long and brutal. Pilots returned exhausted, faces gray from oxygen deprivation and fear. The enemy was more unpredictable now, their formations ragged, their tactics desperate. It was as if the Luftwaffe knew their empire was crumbling and had decided to burn what remained of it in the air. On one mission, flight was ambushed by a group of 190s emerging from a cloud bank. The sky erupted in chaos. 2 Mustangs went down in flames within seconds. Rolled hard, cutting into the attacker's path, his guns chattering a furious response. He scored 1 kill, then another before breaking off to protect a crippled bomber limping home. When he finally landed, his oxygen system had frozen and he could barely speak. Later that night, in the dim glow of the operations hut, he removed his gloves and looked at his trembling hands. His crew chief offered him coffee, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he just stared at the map on the wall, red pins pushing deeper into Germany every week, and wondered how many more names would be lost before the pins reached Berlin. The following month brought something hadn't expected: orders from higher command. He was to report to London for a ceremony. The Medal of Honor had been approved. When he arrived at the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, reporters lined the courtyard. Cameras flashed. Officers saluted. The atmosphere was celebratory, almost unreal. Stood before the gathered crowd, his uniform pressed, his ribbons gleaming under the gray sky. A general stepped forward, reading the citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, in action against enemy forces, on 11 January 1944. The words rolled on, a list of numbers, odds, and valor. Heard them distantly as though they belonged to someone else. When the medal was placed around his neck, the applause seemed far away, muffled like echoes through fog. He smiled politely for the photographs, shook hands, and thanked the officers. But later, in the quiet of his quarters, he took the medal from its box and turned it over in his hand. It was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. He thought of the men who hadn't come back, the ones who'd fought just as bravely but never made it home to tell their stories. To him, the medal wasn't his alone. It belonged to all of them. When he returned to, his squadron greeted him with cheers. Someone had painted a small golden star beneath the tiger's head on Ding, laughed, genuinely this time. "You boys didn't have to do that," he said. "Couldn't help it, sir," one of the pilots replied. "She's earned it as much as you have." That night the base celebrated, beer, laughter, the brief illusion that the war might be ending soon. But amid the noise, found himself sitting apart, watching the bonfire flicker in the dark. A few younger pilots joined him, asking questions about that day over. "What was it like, sir?" one asked softly, "being up there alone?" Thought for a long moment before answering. "It's quiet," he said finally. "Too quiet, you stop hearing the radio. The world shrinks to what's right in front of you, the sights, the wings, the enemy's shadow. You don't think about dying, you just keep moving." They listened in silence. For them, he was a legend speaking from another world. But too, he was just telling the truth, the quiet, unromantic truth that no newspaper would ever print. As summer approached, preparations for the Allied invasion of France intensified. The 354th Fighter Group was placed on high alert. Their missions shifted from long-range escorts to tactical support, hitting rail lines, convoys, and airfields across occupied France. The pace was relentless. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, stood on the tarmac, watching wave after wave of transport planes heading south across the Channel. Operation Overlord D-Day had begun. He could see the faint glimmer of dawn over the horizon and hear the low thunder of engines fatting into the mist. He turned to one of his flight leaders. "It's starting," he said quietly. For the next several weeks, and his men flew constant sorties over Normandy, strafing enemy columns, engaging stragglers, and protecting the fragile bridgehead below. The once invincible Luftwaffe was now fragmented and desperate. Many German pilots flew without radios, relying only on instinct. The air war had shifted decisively. The Allies owned the sky. Still, every victory came with ghosts. Lost more men that summer than in any other period of the war. Each loss cut deep. He attended every briefing, signed every condolence letter, and made sure every empty bunk was honored. By late August, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. Paris was liberated. The end of the war, once an impossible dream, now seemed inevitable. And yet, for the feeling was bittersweet. He had become the embodiment of what American air power stood for: courage, precision, defiance. But deep inside, he remained haunted by the faces of those who hadn't lived to see the turning tide. He still wrote letters to the families of his men, always ending them the same way. They did their duty, they fought for each other, and they made a difference. As 1944 drew toward its bloody conclusion, found himself standing again in a briefing room, a new map pinned to the wall, this time with Allied lines stretching deep into France, the Rhine glimmering on the edge of possibility. The war was changing, but one truth remained. For every pilot who took to the skis, for every man who climbed into a bomber, for every crew chief who fueled another sortie, the fight was personal. And for Major James, the one-man Air Force, it always would be. By the winter of 1944, the world had begun to change, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. The Nazi war machine was cracking under the weight of its own ambition. The Allies had reclaimed France, driven across Belgium, and stood at the very edge of Germany. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skis, was now a ghost of its former self, its veterans dead or captured, its airfields bombed to rubble, its pilots sent aloft with barely a week's training. And yet, even in those final months, the air war did not grow easier. The Germans fought with the ferocity of the cornered. Jet-powered Me-262s now sliced through the clouds, faster than anything the Allies had seen before. The flak batteries along the Rhine grew thicker, their black bursts filling the heavens. The cost of every victory was measured not in miles, but in names. Major James watched it all with the quiet weariness of a man who had seen too much sky, too much smoke, too much death. His squadron had changed faces. The eager young pilots who had once looked to him as an idol were gone, replaced by new recruits who only knew him as a legend. To them, the one-man Air Force was something out of myth, a tale whispered in mess halls between missions. Never spoke of that day anymore. If someone asked, he would shrug and say, it was a job that needed doing, and then he'd walk away. But inside, the memory never faded. The roar of engines, the flash of tracers, the lonely silence between radio bursts, they came to him in dreams, vivid as ever. Each time he climbed into ding and fastened the harness, he could almost hear the ghosts of those he'd fought beside whispering in the wind. By late 1944, had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to command the 361st Fighter Group. His leadership style remained unchanged, calm, precise, without ego. When morale faltered, he didn't give speeches. He simply flew the next mission himself. His men followed because they trusted him, not the legend, but the man. The bitter cold of December brought with its final gamble, the Ardennes offensive, what the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. The skis were stormy, grounding Allied air support for days. Then, when the clouds finally broke, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts returned to the fight, tearing into German convoys, tanks, and supply lines. Flew as often as command would allow. He had long since lost count of his missions, his kills, or the number of times he'd come home with his plane held together by sheer will and luck. But he never lost the sense of duty that had carried him from Burma's jungles to the heart of Europe. When the Allied armies finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945, watched from above as columns of armor rolled eastward across a Germany reduced to ruin. Smoke rose from shattered cities, rivers glimmered like silver wounds. It was victory, but not triumph. On one of his last missions, he flew high above the Elbe River, the clouds beneath him soft and white. The radio was quiet, no enemy contacts, no flak bursts, just the endless hum of the Merlin engine. For the first time in years, the sky felt empty. He throttled back and looked down, watching the world he'd fought to free slipping quietly beneath his wings. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, there were celebrations across every airfield in England. Champagne bottles, laughter, the music of gramophones blaring into the night, but stayed on the outskirts as he always did. He stood beside his Mustang, running a hand along the metal that had carried him through hell and back. Sergeant Bill King, his old crew chief, found him there. "War over, sir," he said with a grin. "You can finally take a rest." Smiled faintly. "Rest," he repeated. "Haven't heard that word in a while." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small Medal of Honor box, still worn from travel. He turned it in his hands, the gold catching the dim light. Then he looked up at Ding, at the bullet holes still patched from old missions, the faded paint, the silent strength of it, and whispered, "You did good, girl. We both did." When he finally left Europe, it was with little ceremony. No grand speeches, no parades, just another flight across the Atlantic, one last sunrise over the sea. In the years that followed, returned to a quieter life. He stayed in the Air Force, rose through the ranks, and later served with distinction in the newly formed Air Defense Command. But he never sought fame, never traded his story for glory. When people asked about the one-man Air Force, he'd smile and change the subject. "The real story," he'd say, "is about the men who didn't come back." Yet history would not forget him. His Medal of Honor citation became required reading at flight schools. His name was etched into the annals of air power, studied by generations of pilots who would one day chase the same skis he once ruled. In his later years, he often attended reunions with the men of the 8th Air Force. Gray-haired now, faces lined but eyes bright, they would sit in folding chairs beneath hangar lights and remember the days when the world hung in the balance. One evening during one of those reunions, a young airman approached him. "Colonel, sir," the boy said nervously, "I just wanted to say your story, what made me want to fly." Looked at him for a long moment, then smiled softly. "Then make sure you fly for the right reasons, son," he said. "Not for medals, not for glory, but because someone out there needs you to." The young man nodded, not fully understanding, but knowing he'd heard something true. As the night went on, stepped outside into the cool air. Above him the stars shimmered, vast and endless, the same sky he had fought beneath decades earlier. Somewhere up there, he imagined, were the spirits of those who had never come home, still flying, still guarding the quiet heavens they'd once died for. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant echo of engines only he could hear. And in that stillness, the legend of James, the man who had once faced 30 enemies alone and refused to turn back, lived on, not in the medal on his chest or the stories in the papers, but in the sky itself. The same sky that, for one extraordinary day, had belonged to him alone. Oh, the end,